Welcome back. We continue our in-depth look at the year's top political stories. Boyd Matheson is the opinion editor for the Deseret News, and Matt Canham is the senior managing editor for the Salt Lake Tribune. All right, let's get right into this, you guys. Conversion therapy. We saw this play out in the legislative session. It really became quite bitter. It got to the point where advocates were very hopeful, but a substitute bill came in. Death threats came in against the person who brought in that substitute bill. Why did it turn out that way in the beginning?
Yeah, I think it's one of those issues that doing it through the legislative part of things was just didn't seem to have any traction. Little spurts here, and you had advocacy groups on both sides really playing out, and I think the legislature didn't get it engaged early enough. And so it's hard to get a good compromise when you're under pressure at the end of a session. And so that's why I think we ended up where we are with things coming from the executive branch.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting debate too. What should be done through the executive branch versus the legislative branch is interesting.
Let's stick with that, because what we had here is, instead of going legislative, the governor proposes a rule administratively. What do you make of that route, going that way, as opposed to trying to get it done through the legislature?
The interesting part is he got that idea from activists who sat outside his office and demanded an apology for him not backing the bill during the legislature. One of those activists brought up, why don't we just do it by a rule? The governor thought about it and said, maybe I didn't make the best decision there. Maybe I can try this a different way. I applaud an elected official listening to a constituent and taking action. We have lots of ways that we govern different types of professions. And this is one where this is a practice that is disavowed by pretty much everybody. So those professional institutions were all about doing this by rule. So it actually was an interesting pathway.
One thing I want to ask you guys about on this is, I should have looked at the exact number of states, but it's less than half.
19.
19. Okay, so we become the 19th. I knew it was in the high teens. Again, Utah, you wouldn't think, looking back, Utah would be, in the leading edge of getting this done. We've seen that with non-discrimination and LGBTQ rights bill. We've seen that with medical marijuana. Is this another area where Utah is kind of surprising the nation?
I don't know if I would say it's surprising. I actually think the other was. I think because this is an issue that people here deal with, if you have a different gender identity or sexual orientation, then that conflicts with some of your beliefs. You're going to hit that more head on. So it probably happens here more, or been a bigger part of the conversation here. You also have the LDS Church, which has already decided that this is a bad policy. This is a bad way to go. So then it's just negotiating the details. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was neutral in the bill during the session, which is a sign that they were ready for this to happen. So then it says, how do we get there? So in some ways, I think it isn't that surprising.
Yeah, and I agree. It's not surprising to people in Utah. It's surprising to people across the country, because the country has become conditioned that when you have things that appear to be a false choice, you either have to be, LGBTQ rights or religious liberty rights, those are often false choices. And the governor proved that, and he proved really the Utah model, that the solution to any problem begins when someone says, let's talk about it. And you get the right people in the room, you get past the talking points, you agree that these polar opposites are fake fights and false choices, and that there is a way to get to the right kind of compromise. The integrity of compromise is what I think Utah does best, and that is real compromise. You bring everything to the table and you really do come out with a good solution.
Let's move on to another big story of the year, a new mayor for Utah's capital city. First, that entailed the current mayor, Jackie Biskupski, bowing out of the race.
Right.
What will her legacy be?
That's a tough question. Jackie has made, the mayor, Biskupski, has made a lot of decisions that impact air quality that she worked very hard on. We see downtown rising that will be part of her legacy. She's put a lot of plans in place, the nuts and bolts work of a mayor. She also had a lot of divisive relationships. She did not get along with the city council. She did not get along with the governor or the legislature, even though she started having some allies there. And she kind of isolated herself, I think.
I want to get into those relationships in a bit, but first, let's talk about how the race unfolded, because a year ago, it looked like Jim Dabakis had an insurmountable lead. Here comes Erin Mendenhall, who didn't even enter the race, by the way, until Mayor Biskupski announced that she was out. And she came up and won the race. How did that all happen?
Yeah, and that was also not surprising, because it was all about the disciplines, practical, tactical, boots on the ground, knocking doors. She had an extraordinary structure in place with disciplines. And so while the polls were saying Senator DeBacchus was way ahead on a middle of the summer primary, off-year election. It's all about ground game, organization, and discipline, and she showed that that works. And again, without a plurality rule in there, she was able to win that primary with, what, 22, 23% of the vote.
Well, and I think DeBacchus is someone that everyone knew and you had an opinion on. He was very well known in our city, and I think that there were people who liked him, and there were plenty who decided he wasn't their favorite, and so he didn't have a lot of area to grow.
Okay, so real quick, back to the relationship part. We saw the governor show up to Aaron's victory party on election night. What does that signal moving ahead with the relationship between the city and state?
It shows that Aaron wants to be a relationship-building mayor, that she already has an established relationship with our governor. They've worked on air quality issues together. He donated to her campaign. I think it's a turning of the page, though I don't think the policy objectives of Mayor Biskupski and soon-to-be Mayor Mendenhall are that different.
Okay, let's move on. I kind of heard some foreshadowing as you guys were talking about this mayor's race as we look into the race for governor.
Yes.
We have 4 Republicans officially in. How do you make what do you make of this race at this point?
Yeah, I think you will have more to come as we get into early into the new year. I think you could have 2 or 3 more significant names get into that race. With the dual track system, it is not out of the question that you could have 5 Republicans on the primary ballot in a very late June. It's only a few days before.
I think I just heard you say that.
Yes.
It's really late in the, it's a couple of days before the 4th of July weekend.
Yeah.
So organization, structure, it's going to be much more an organization campaign than a name ID. A lot of the early polls are clearly name ID polls, but this is going to be a boots on the ground battle, I think, in the end.
And just like the mayor's race, you talked about DeBacchus having the name ID. We have candidates with the name ID in the governor's race.
Yeah, and I do think that politics is becoming more nationalized. And I think it's interesting to look at the candidates by their relationship to the president. So you have Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox, who is not a Trump fan.
But he's kind of been quiet on that lately, though.
Right, I'm sure he has been, but it's hard to get past your past.
Especially in a presidential year, for sure.
You have former Governor John Huntsman, who worked for Trump, but has been relatively neutral in his statements. And we assume that former House Speaker Greg Hughes will get in the race, and he has been a huge Trump supporter.
Right.
When you have that plurality factor, I think in a presidential year, that actually might play a big part of this.
Yeah.
So could it be, we saw the last poll out of Utah Policy, and it showed Cox and Huntsman clear front runners in this. Could this be another situation where someone could come up and surprise us?
Yeah, I think it's one where, again, if you have 5 people in a primary, technically you could win with 21% of the vote, right? So I think that will play out. The name ID always helps early, helps in the fundraising, but this is going to be a structure and a strategy. And I think it will come down to this kind of message. I think one of the big differences will be, are we content with Utah being a crossroads of the West kind of state, or are we really interested in being a crossroads to the world with inland port and Silicon Slopes and all of those kinds of things?
I'm going to have to end it on that note. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Great conversation. Can't believe another year just goes by like that.
Too fast.
Yep. I'll see you again next year.
We'll be
Sounds
here.
good.
All right.